I don't know that it's an apology, but I want to at least warn you who are visiting today and those of you who join us through YouTube and iTunes that this might be about the strangest Easter sermon you've ever heard. I remember hearing a lecture delivered by Bright Divinity School homiletics professor Joey Jeter, in which he was berating a room full of preachers for delivering such dull and absolutely horrible Easter sermons, when Easter's somehow supposed to be a really important day. It's supposed to be typically the day of our largest attendance and something to do with the central witness of our faith. And frankly, I couldn't have agreed with him more. I've heard a lot of bad Easter sermons, and worse than that, I've delivered a lot of bad Easter sermons. But what I found particularly unusual that day is that I had heard Joey Jeter deliver an Easter sermon, and it was one of the worst I'd ever heard. The problem was not that every preacher in the room is so intimidated by the larger crowd on Easter, but I think the problem goes more to the message itself. When you start with the premise, here's a common definition of Christianity: you are so bad that God had to kill himself. And if you are able to make yourself believe that preposterous assertion, then you are rewarded for being willing to believe that by spending eternity in bliss in heaven. Now, if that's the preacher's task, no wonder most of those sermons are pretty bad. You're on pretty shaky ground just getting started. You cannot reasonably fault the gathering of preachers for not being able to sell that story to a sophisticated modern audience. The whole notion of substitutionary death, which may have been a meaningful symbol to people who lived in a culture where animal sacrifice to appease demonic gods was at least something that they had a cultural memory of, that might have worked, but it has only stuck in Western culture because we've spent centuries promising children that they will, in fact, little Johnny and Susie, burn in hell forever if you don't believe exactly what we're telling you. And thankfully, we don't do that to our children anymore, but because we don't threaten them, the basic premise gets harder and harder to sell. But the traditional church, faced with the fact that its central message is losing its power in our generation, has tried to reinvigorate, to resuscitate the corpse, as it were, to resurrect that message. And what they've done is they've tried to freshen it up with video clips and high-tech razzle-dazzle, supplemented with a really great basketball program and some even a Starbucks in the lobby. All of which reminds me of those experiences we have when we have to go to a funeral home and you walk up to the casket of the deceased and people are saying, "Doesn't he look natural? Doesn't he look like he's just sleeping?" And you're not allowed to say what you want to say, which is, "No, actually he looks dead, and worse than that, it looks like he's got too much makeup on. Really, this is overdone." The church has tried to switch the dead body of a bad message with a different dead body, or to gussy up the old cadaver with convincing lighting and makeup, and by and large, discerning people just aren't buying it. The cover of Newsweek magazine this week shows the image of a Jesus-type figure wearing street clothes and standing on a busy New York street. And the cover bears the caption, "Forget the church, follow Jesus," which is a pretty inviting option, an option that more and more of us have been exercising. Historical Jesus scholarship of the past 200 years has left us with little doubt that the real Jesus was killed by the Roman government, not because he was a divine blood offering to satisfy a bloodthirsty God, but because the real Jesus posed a threat to the security and the authority of the state. Rome didn't get involved in killing religious zealots. Rome got involved in killing people who were a threat to the state. That's how empires survive. He was in conflict with the economic system. Jesus threatened the government system, which made its profit, which built its armies by abusing the poor and the vulnerable, the sick, the widow, and the orphan. And if you look at the conflicts and the conversations that Jesus has recorded, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, the primary conflict is between his message of radical compassion and their presumption of a purity system, that you had to maintain a certain religious purity. That's the primary conflict, that Jesus' message of forgiveness, of love, of radical compassion, of selling what you own, of living outside of the assumptions and the laws of the empire, that's where the fights came from. Now, the later church and the much later empire all but extinguished the message of Jesus. It's not just in this reading that Mary did for us this morning about Mary. I always like to have a Mary read a Mary text, and thankfully we've got Marys in the church. But you have this very metaphorical text in which Mary doesn't recognize Jesus. And I think that is a symbol for the church in generation after generation after generation. We've got some religious creedalism that we recognize, but we don't recognize Jesus. We have difficulty getting at him. The church, the later church, and certainly the Constantinian Empire replaced that threatening message of Jesus that challenged the government, that challenged the economic system, that challenged the abuse of the poor and the widowed and the orphaned. They replaced that with a religious set of doctrines about atonement and redemption and the Trinity and afterlife salvation. But folks, that was not the message of Jesus. And those of us who were in the progressive movement, frankly, are tired of trying to adapt the message of Jesus to those kinds of religious constructs that actually fly in the face of the message of Jesus. The real message of Easter, if you take the metaphor seriously, is that even though the empire succeeded in killing Jesus, the message did not die. The message cannot be put in a tomb. The message of Jesus cannot be killed because you cannot kill an idea. You cannot kill a concept. You cannot imprison a message. Now you look at the creeds that emerged from the empire's meeting at Nicaea. It's all about virgin birth, the crucifixion, the resurrection, but not a single word about what Jesus taught. I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. What happened in that comma? Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. The church managed to extinguish the entire message of Jesus, not a word of what he said. And yet, the empire could not keep the message in the tomb in Jerusalem. So the empire put the message in a much more secure tomb, the church. The tomb of the creeds, the list of doctrines and beliefs. In his Newsweek article, Andrew Sullivan references the opinion of Thomas Jefferson that the teachings of Jesus were buried in the embellishments of the evangelists. And Jefferson said they were like diamonds glittering in the most sublime and benevolent code of morals that has ever been offered, but hidden in a dunghill. What was literally obvious to Thomas Jefferson, who was not theologically educated, he was not a biblical linguist, but he just read it. And reading it, it was obvious to him that the actual message of Jesus was one of the most clear, wonderful, benevolent codes of morality ever given to humanity, but that it was hidden in all of these embellishments of the biblical writers and of the later church. And even if you're reticent to reference the miracle accounts and the substitutionary death and incarnation and creedal beliefs of Scripture in the church as a dunghill, as President Jefferson did, still, don't you want the diamonds? I mean, it seems that the church so much doesn't recognize Jesus that they elevate fight over, literally have wars over, the dunghill and never find the diamonds. We don't have a big beef with traditional Christians if they are willing to also listen to what Jesus taught. I mean, if you've got to, have your magic rituals, whatever, do whatever you got to do, but will you also meet us at the point of working for social justice? Will you also advocate for the poor? Will you take the message of Jesus and join us in doing what he did? But to use Jefferson's words, most of the church really likes the dunghill. And that's something that, I don't know about you, but I'm just not willing to play along anymore. I'm just not going to do it anymore. Jefferson cut those diamonds out of his Bible and he pasted them together into a much slimmer version of the Christian message. And it wasn't just for his own benefit. It's something that Sullivan doesn't mention in his article. But Jefferson took that Jefferson Bible that he produced and he had it reprinted at taxpayer expense and gave it to every member of Congress. Can you even imagine that happening today? I mean, a president who cut up the Bible and reprinted it at taxpayer expense and distributed it would be impeached at best. Why is it that 250 years ago Americans were so much smarter and more open-minded than they are now? Because fundamentalism and literalism are modern inventions. Fundamentalism, the list of Christian fundamentals and the approach to Scripture as being entirely literal was something that actually came out of Princeton. Princeton, when I was at Harvard, we referred to Princeton as that conservative school in the South. We tend to not think of Princeton as a conservative school, but that's where the Presbyterians came up with the list of fundamentals back in the early part of the scientific revolution in our country. Jesus did not come to earth to be a sacrifice for our sins. He was killed because he fought against poverty. He was killed because he fought against injustice. He was killed because he refused to pass judgment on the broken and marginalized members of society. He fought against the cruelty of the world. And if you are willing to take his message seriously, then you have every reason to expect some of the same treatment that he received. Now, thankfully, crucifixion's gone out of vogue. You just don't hear of it that often anymore. But imprisonment and persecution, not out of vogue. The application of the teachings of Jesus to our day, once rescued from the dung heap of religious language and superstition, drives the progressive church to be concerned about matters of the most great urgency. Number one is international peace, fighting poverty, resisting prejudice and oppression, ending violence, and protecting the environment. Those are the issues that we will either address the teachings of Jesus to those crucial survival issues in the 21st century, or the church will cease to exist. And quite frankly, I will dance at the funeral. If the church refuses to address the issues of greatest moral importance, then we should plow them all down and put something useful there. We need more parking here in this community. But we can expect, if we take the message of Jesus to the issues that are of great importance in our culture, we can expect opposition. Some of you are familiar, I hope many of you are familiar with the case of Tim DeChristopher. He was an environmental activist in Utah, gone back to college at the time. But in 2008, at the very end of the Bush administration, as Bush was about to leave office, the Bureau of Land Management decided to put together a hasty auction of oil and mineral rights around some of the national parks in Utah. They did this completely disregarding all of the laws that were germane to the maintenance of that land. But just as a closing of the administration, they put together this auction. So DeChristopher and some others went to protest, and he just got an idea. He just registered as a bidder, got one of the bidding paddles, and went into the auction. And he bid over $2 million buying up land rights around the national parks. Of course, he didn't have any money. He was just trying to protect the land, which embarrassed the Bureau of Land Management because they were trying quickly to get this done before the administration changed. And it's not uncommon for people to go and overbid and not be able to have the money. No one ever in the history of America, no one has ever even been fined for making bids that they couldn't pay. But because he had embarrassed the Bureau of Land Management, they decided to press charges against Christopher. And he was imprisoned. And men and women, it's 2012, and he's in prison today. And because he continued to write about environmental issues and to call attention to what was done to him, a member of Congress, and members of Congress can do this without signing it themselves or identifying who's doing it. A member of Congress has had DeChristopher moved into solitary confinement so that he can no longer have contact with the media. The people DeChristopher was outbidding for these illegal oil and mineral rights were none other than the famous Koch brothers, whose political clout is suspected of being behind having a congressman secretly move DeChristopher into solitary confinement, denying him his rights as an American citizen, his right to protest, his right to free speech. As I said, crucifixion is out of vogue, but that doesn't mean the empire doesn't want to put the message in a tomb. Now, I hate conspiracy theorists. Folks, I go to lots of liberal type meetings, and I've gotten up and walked out of a lot of them when people start to go off the deep end. You know, I've had people want me to get involved in, the government's putting chemicals in the vapor trails behind jets and, just crazy. There's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on in liberal meetings. It's Fox News has its other end of crazy speculations. I can't stand those things. The only good reason to be a liberal is to be open-minded enough to embrace the truth, no matter what the truth is. And I think this is where people from more conserving perspectives will want to tell you, you can't think that. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not, you can't think that. And if being liberal means anything, it means that you are open-minded enough to embrace new ideas, regardless of what the consequences may be. But men and women, if you're so open-minded that your brains fall out, you're not doing the cause any good. Scaring one another with outrageous rumors of political power abuses only serves to marginalize the movement and make us look foolish. But what I will tell you today that is absolutely true, last month, middle of March, President Obama signed an innocuously named bill, H.R. 347, and it is entitled Federal Restricted Building and Grounds Improvement Act. Federal Restricted Building and Grounds Improvement Act. Now that sounds like they're going to paint and cut the grass, doesn't it? That sounds like a cutting the shrubs kind of act. But what it actually is more commonly called the Anti-Occupy Bill, because it has been aimed at giving the police the authority to arrest and imprison up to 2 years those of us who are involved in the Occupy movement. If you are protesting on a site where there is Secret Service present, that is, if I should say something insulting about Rick Santorum at a Rick Santorum gathering, I could go to prison for 2 years under H.R. 347. Look it up. This year, as spring brings back the protesters against the massive income disparity that is turning America into a third world economy with a tiny, tiny super wealthy aristocracy and a massive peasant class, protest that we participated in legally last year will now be deemed to be illegal. In Jefferson's day, which was certainly much more dangerous than our own, Thomas Jefferson was around and they were writing the Bill of Rights. The permanency of our democracy was certainly under question, but they guaranteed the right of free speech. Now in the 21st century, the rights of citizens to peacefully assemble and protest is attempting to be taken away by a nearly unanimous vote of Congress. There were only 3 congressmen that voted against this bill. 3. And one of them was Ron Paul. Do you know how uncomfortable I feel when I'm having to get happy about something that Ron Paul has done? Only 3 votes of dissent. Republicans and Democrats alike are afraid of the Occupy protest, and they will certainly come back this spring. I would love to have believed that this was something that our own Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill would have helped to fight in the Senate, but when that bill went to the Senate to vote, they decided to do it by consensus so that they didn't have to take a roll call vote. There was no opposition, none, no opposition at all, and so there's no record of anyone particularly voting for it. And Barack Obama signed it. There will almost certainly be people arrested this year in peaceful demonstrations who are protesting the corporate control of our economy and our government, because men and women, the empire always wants to put Jesus back in the tomb. The empire will let the church out if we promise to keep the diamonds of the ethical teachings of Jesus hidden in a dunghill of very bad, boring hymns, incomprehensible dogmas, prayers, rituals, and magic incantations. But if you take the compassionate message of Jesus into the streets of the United States, the nation that wants to believe itself to be the most freedom-loving nation in the world, you may very well get to see the inside of a prison cell this spring. Now, they can imprison a corpulent cleric, but they cannot entomb the truth. We will not stand idly by and give silent consent to the abuse of the elderly, the poor, the sick, the immigrant, or the mentally ill. Protests that many of us participated in quite legally last fall may now be considered to be federal violations of law, and that will intimidate an awful lot of people into silence. That will cut down the numbers. People are not all that eager to go to prison, and I promise you that I'm not either. I'm not eager to do it, but I also promise you that I will not be intimidated into silence. I have no particular desire at the age of 55 to be arrested and imprisoned, and I trust that those of you who don't get arrested or imprisoned, if I am, that you will keep working to get me out. Don't let them put me into solitary confinement and leave me there for 4 years as they have Tim DeChristopher. The meaning of Easter is that the message of Jesus cannot be crucified. The message cannot be entombed, imprisoned, or silenced. As long as there is a community of faith that has the courage to rise up from the tomb and walk away from the irrelevance, magic, superstition, and ignorance that the empire wants to saddle us with. You are not dead, men and women, so don't act like you are.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.